Welcome to the Business of Soil Health. I'm Patrick Smith, the founder of Soil Upside.
And I'm Sammy Telleton, the co-founder of FarmRaise.
I am super happy to have Reid Hensen with us here today. He's the managing partner at Celium Group. This is a conversation that we've been overdue to have, and Reid has a pretty wide-ranging perspective on the economics of soil health. So really happy to have you here, Reid. My understanding, just from our conversations that we've had, your background is as a rancher. You have a master's in agricultural economics. You're a data nerd, now running a software development consultancy. And you are a stand-up comedian or aspiring stand-up comedian.
That's it. That's the run of it. Yeah.
We have high expectations for you today.
The aspiring, I just want to emphasize that I've been to 3 classes, so have very limited hopes if you can.
I'm curious if you can just sketch your background a little bit and sort of how that has informed your perspective on economics of soil health.
Yeah, definitely. So, I ended up living in Chile when I was my last year of high school. I grew up in the suburbs of Denver, just a suburban kid, and ended up living in this tiny town in Chile. And it was the population of like 3,000 people, and it was a sheep ranching community and a fishing community on the Magellan Strait. And randomly, I ended up working on this sheep ranch after school, and then traveled around with my host uncle who was a sheep shearer. And I thought, man, like making money from the land like this is awesome. So fast forward, I come back to the States. I'm in Montana for college, and all my buddies are going to fight fire in the summer times. And I think, I kind of want to go back to that ranching thing. Like I see cows and sheep all around here in Montana. Maybe I could go find a ranching gig. And I did here in Bozeman, about 11 years ago now. And just a summer job working on a ranch. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to study in school. And I was really interested in ecology. I've always hung out with ecologists. They're all my friends, nerdy biologists, wildlife biologists, those kind of folks. But I was like, I'm just not that good at biology. And like that sort of hard science wasn't for me. And I ended up studying psychology and business because I was interested in this element of ecological systems that we like to call the Homo sapien, right? Like I was very intrigued on how the human is interacting with these landscapes and how we're making money off of them, how we're using them for our mental health, just all of these different components of how humans interact with their landscapes. And that is kind of a question that still inspires me to do kind of everything that we do. And we're interested in how do we engage the human with their landscapes. And when we think about soil being kind of the foundation of much of our ecological systems, pretty much all of them, right? And so how do we think of different ways to use that soil and engage with that soil as the human is really where a lot of my schooling came from and a lot of my interests, both intellectually and professionally. So I would say the last thing I'll round that out with is I went back to grad school for agricultural economics to really kind of round out, I guess, some of that education of psychology and business, and then really thinking about the economics piece of the whole equation and just getting a broader toolkit to be able to analyze that.
And today, how would you qualify, or what do you want to share about the focus of your work now at Celium?
Yeah, so Celium spun up a few years ago out of a few different contracts that we were working on and I had the idea, like, can we bring together a team to work across the sector, not raise any venture money. We're not like a venture-backed tech startup, but really just like see if we can meet all of these organizations exactly where they are in kind of their data management process as they try to work with farmers and ranchers and land stewards to create some sort of behavioral change. And so that led us down the road of working on a lot of climate smart commodities grants, because that was at the time alive and well. Today, maybe a little less so. And kind of a wide gamut of clientele, running from like the Nature Conservancy to small little niche like startups who needed help thinking about data structures, and research universities, the USDA, kind of a bunch of different clients, all really needing help focusing their technology side of whatever they were delivering. And so like today, for instance, our biggest client is the Soil Health Institute, and who's working on doing just this. How do we scale the efforts of building soil health and do that with a technology platform that we're building alongside them, and we're really excited about.
Given the scope of your experience, which you outlined here, but I'm really looking forward to digging into the weeds, but it includes solar company that was financing regenerative ag. It includes some deep work in a program around technical assistance. It includes, there's all sorts of experience that you've had. So as we were sort of thinking about the conversation today, we thought that we would use our 12 financial levers of soil health as a rough framing of this. So I thought that we would just start with on-farm profitability, in particular management change. So I think about this in two ways: management practice change and stacked enterprises. On the management practice change front, can you tell us a little bit about your project, your EIR project, Entrepreneur in Residence project, and kind of the role that you see technical assistance playing in management practice change?
Totally. So this goes back to maybe my psychology background. Well, actually, before I jump into all of this, I just want to say on the recording, I have strong opinions, but they're all loosely held. So if anybody comes up with a better idea, I'll be the first to say I was wrong and change my mind. But I'll act like I know what I'm talking about for as long as until somebody does that. So it's a feature and a bug of being me. So management practice change is this interesting thing, right? We're seeing all of these projects spin up, and a lot of our clients, right? So my business partner, Joven, comes from a whole background of analytics platforms and payment distribution. My background, at least from a technical perspective, is really in geospatial data engineering. When we think about what these projects, these management practice change projects, the way that they're typically structured is you take a geospatial asset, right? A farm field boundary, an acreage of some kind, a measurement of unit. You tie that to a cost of doing the practice, and then you would roll that up into a contract that somebody holds with a farmer and either with the government, or maybe it's with a nonprofit who's acting as an intermediary between corporates, et cetera. And there's kind of this standard data structure that we've seen across all of them. And there was actually a great article that was just released by Dr. Maria Bauman and some other colleagues about the durability of these practice changes, right? We've built the data system to manage how do you deliver payments to, an $80 million project and keep track of where it happened, how much needs to get paid, where is the status of the payment, what sort of GHG protocols you need to manage associated to that. We've built all of that. But I think at its core, you want to think about the durability. And so to your point, Patrick, our work with the Nature Conservancy was really, they were like, is there a software platform that will just fix the problem? And we build software. And unfortunately, it was bad for business, but we were like, no, I don't really think that this is a software problem. The durability that happens after these practices are paid for is really in the relationships that those people now hold with somebody new who might think a little different, right? Like that's how we make decisions. I use the anecdote a lot of I was buying a new car, right? And I'm an economist and a data nerd. So I built depreciation schedules. I was like analyzing everything, and I was like, okay, well, the Toyotas depreciate slowest, but then the purchase price is higher. And I was like modeling it all out, just like a total nerd, right? And I would go to like the car lot and I would just be overwhelmed because I was like, I have all the data, but I don't know how to make this decision. Right. And then when it came the day where I got in this pickup, I called my brother and I said, Scott, you're really good at buying stuff. Do you think this is a good truck? And I didn't look at any of the spreadsheets. I called somebody who I trusted, who's always been better at buying stuff than me. And he said, oh, that's a sick truck. You should totally buy that truck. And I said, sweet, I'm buying the truck. Like that's how we make decisions at our core, even if you're the most rational person using all the spreadsheets you can possibly use. And so we really focused in on in that project on saying like, these are great starts to building relationships, these contracts and these sort of pay for practice changes. The durable change happens when you become you're part of a broader network of practice of people who are thinking about these things in creative ways and will help you problem solve when, you want to put in a new fence line, but you don't want to do a permanent fence. And like, should I use single strand or double strand electric high tensile? Like, can I get away with one? You need somebody who's just like, who's done that and you can talk to. And that's where the durable changes come, is in the community and in the people and the relationships.
That resonates so much, Reid. So thank you for highlighting that. I think we hear that anecdotes like that a lot in agriculture when it comes to how farmers make these decisions related to soil health. And I'm glad you also mentioned this question around what is a software problem, and these more relational pieces of our work are not solved right by software today. So what do you think what is an appropriate software problem in ag?
A great question. We love this. So we like intentionally, we like on our website, we're always just like, we are a team of engineers, all of us write code, but like we don't like to lead with that, right? Because all technology does is it's like an amplifier of the system you have. So if you have a bad system and you put technology on top of it, it's probably going to be a worse system. But if you have a really strong operational process and you map technology to that appropriately, it's likely to be really, really powerful. And so I think the key thing to think of like, when is technology the right solution, is, are you buffering against operational processes that you cannot scale your system because the burden of like data management is just too much. In 2025, there's so many cool ways to build technological process to map to your operational process, but that's a carefully crafted thing. And it's kind of why Celium Group came about, because the SaaS products that exist, a lot of them are trying to force their system onto whatever your team has done, which sometimes works, and no shade on that at all. But what we found is like, a lot of teams just need to even like educate themselves and learn what is possible, and kind of the step before choosing the technology that they're going to go with. And then mapping that of like, and we oftentimes tell our clients, like, you don't need custom software. You just need a Monday dashboard or an Airtable to manage this. Or sometimes we're like, no, you have a pretty complicated process, and in order to deliver the value you're after, I think we're going to need to build out some software tooling here. And so I think a lot of it for us is really on just the human element and learning our clients' goals. And a lot of times I think technology can help you scale a system that's already working, but it's not going to fix. What we hear a lot in this sector is like, we're going to build a platform, and like somehow a platform is going to fix the problem. And to use an experience from a ranch I worked at, that was just, I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss, but like a total shit show, to be honest. And we were there, and the guy who was managing it was like, I'm going to hire an intern. That'll fix the problem. We just need more hands in the pot. And me and my partner at the time were like, I don't think an intern fixes your shit show. Like you don't hire an intern to get you out of the weeds. That's going to cost you more than it's going to solve for you. And I think sometimes people treat technology a little similarly. It's like, we're going to hire an intern to fix our problems and fix your problems first.
So to continue with the TNC case study, what did you end up recommending and or building?
Yeah, so we kind of recommended a broader system of technical assistance, especially, so this isn't a new idea. Very few ideas are, but in the ranching space, which is what we were working with the regenerative grazing lands team, there's not a ton of advising layers to the ranching sector. You have your veterinarian, which, has some sort of advising capacity for the ranches. And then some folks at NRCS maybe, and maybe some folks have like range cons that they work with or whatever. But what we saw in like the cropping space, for instance, is it's a certified crop advisor, right? Like your CCA is out there advising. And the big ag or ag supplying companies have used that CCA relationship to sell their products into the farming sector. And we were like, well, if we're thinking about selling conservation products into the sector, you need somebody to manage that relationship. And it was a very simple question ultimately of agency is right now. And this is why it's so crucial that like independent crop advisors are really important because agency matters, right? And so if you're an agent of the ranch, so I have 10 ranches that I represent, I'm representing those ranches' best interests. And I'm bringing those pool of ranches to the programs. And then let's say we have a climate smart commodities program that the government rolls out and they're trying to enroll folks into. Me as a representative of my ranches, I can actually say, oh, this program seems to fit these 4 ranches pretty well, but it doesn't map these other 6 because they've already got some carbon projects going on. They don't need it. And then as these programs come and go, which we know they do, you're not trying to hire up a group of people to go sell your new program every time. You're letting that relationship be the durable piece. And then you're bringing those relationships to programs as they spin up or spin down. And then our theory was that there's actually quite a bit of technology that you can use to empower that advisor to do their job better and deliver data from the farm and act as that intermediary for the data, delivering it from the farm or the ranch to those programs that are pretty data intensive. The farmer and rancher just don't want to deal with that. And so we think that there's a person there who deals with it. And we helped TNC think about a business model for that person.
How do you think about that insight, which I agree with? I think that's an awesome suggestion and outcome that you came to. How do you think about that relative to the existing technical assistance infrastructure available to producers through USDA service centers or their soil and water conservation districts? And would it be ideal to have this person live within that infrastructure? How do you think about that?
Well, to be fair, I love our soil and water conservation districts, and NRCS agents are awesome. They catch a lot of flack, but they're awesome people and they care about their communities a ton and they're plugged into the communities, right? Like their kids are going to school, their partner maybe manages a farm or a ranch. Like they are in the communities, which I think is crucial to this to work. What we've seen, unfortunately, at the federal level is just a systematic undervaluing and underfunding of those agents, right? And crucially, and I think what is nice is our pitch here, I think, is actually relatively aligned with this new administration, right? Where they're like, we don't want employees, and kind of this long trend since Ronald Reagan of basically contracting services out from the federal government rather than having federal employees. But those agents who are they're only representing the NRCS. But if the NRCS were to make a TSP, a technical service provider certification, a little easier to get, and then you can sign people up for EQIP and CSP and CRP as an independent agent representing the ranch, not the government, you've now flipped the paradigm just a little bit on its head, where you still have maybe that same person who used to work for the NRCS and got cut because of the Doge cuts or whatever, is now still able to represent the same ranches, but not just to the NRCS, also to the other opportunities that are available to them, which you can house that person in the same office if you wanted, or it can be a private business. We've kind of pitched a public-private partnership is probably the right way to do this, but because there's all these public funds that are really important, but we think allowing that person, to use a good example here, is how many folks have a conservation plan that they don't know they have because it's on file at the NRCS. And some NRCS agent wrote that because they needed to do that before administering EQIP funding. But then that farmer or rancher is never using that conservation plan when they need a grazing management plan to be part of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. They go and they get another one because they didn't even know that there's just one sitting on file at the NRCS. So we just think there's some inefficiencies in that system that could really be solved.
Pulling out of the weeds of government inefficiency and the need for coordinated technical assistance, thinking about this holistically, one of the kind of oversimplifications call it a sort of a myth in regenerative ag, I guess, is that regenerative ag is more profitable than conventional ag. And I'm curious if you have a view on this. Now, there's lots of nuance to this. Time is certainly one of them, but the producer themselves, there's all sorts of different factors. But I'm curious, from the seat that you're sitting in, maybe it's ranching specific, maybe it's system wide, if you have a view, if you can generalize one way or the other on that.
On whether regenerative ag is more profitable?
Yeah.
Well, I'm an economist by training, so I'll just say it depends, because that's what we say. They teach you in day one, just always answer it depends. And then, it doesn't matter what you say after that. I think if you were to look, this is not empirical at all, but I think if you were to look at probably the confounding variable between somebody practicing regenerative agriculture and not practicing regenerative agriculture, and whether or not what's dictating profitability there, is probably a level of attention to their resources, right? Where that's the confounding variable. If you are whether or not you're doing X practice or Y practice, if you're managing a business and you're really attentive to the resources you have available to you, and you have a long time horizon, you're probably going to manage that business better. And regenerative agriculture means a lot of things to a lot of people, but at its core, what it's saying is you're paying a special attention to the resource of your soil, and thinking about that resource as you grow your, the things on top of that soil. And anybody who pays close mind to their resources and can leverage those resources for profit is probably going to be more profitable than somebody who just operates in the day-to-day, always is thinking about what needs to happen tomorrow, and not what needs to happen in a year or 5 years. And that's a really hard balance from, this is not my terminology at all, but I use it all the time. I've even used it with my dad, who's he runs a small remodel business. And I learned it from the Ranching for Profit guys of working on the business versus working in the business. And working in the business is this day-to-day minutia. And if you want to ranch for profit, you're going to work on the business and think about the long term, and you're going to be thinking about the structural components of your business. And when you think about regenerative agriculture, what you're asking somebody to do is to work on the business, right? Because you're saying, hey, don't optimize your extraction on a 1-year basis. Optimize your extraction on a 50-year horizon, and boom, now they're regenerative, right? Because that's naturally the practices will come from that long-term horizon. And they'll choose the right practices for them, right? It won't come from a list of codes that came from the NRCS. It'll be all right, now that I'm thinking about my resource in the long term, what do I need to do that? And farmers are smart people. They have to manage a million different things. They'll figure out the right way to do that.
I'm curious to think about another layer in all of this that every farm needs to navigate and make decisions about, which is stacking income opportunities or different enterprises on the farm. So given your experiences, especially at farm VC, how would you think about stacked enterprises as a lever towards practice change in the long term? And if you could share an example of where you've seen that work or shine, that would be great.
Yeah. So again, I'll circle back to kind of what I was just saying is I think at its core, all of this is, are you an asset manager or are you a farmer? Right. And or a rancher. And to be clear, those are actually really different depending on what you have in front of you. Because some people are I own 5 acres and a bunch of equipment, and I'm leasing a ton of land. And so your job as that operator is to manage those leasing contracts and leverage those for profit for your business. That's your job. And so you can optimize those lease contracts to the best of your ability, but a lot of that's going to be up to the landowner, right? Or to external factors. And then, so let's take the role of somebody who does own land and is managing that land asset. Who do you own the land with, right? So you can build the economic model of the most optimal thing, but if there's one thing I've learned is it never works that way. because you forgot about the person. And it's likely in 2025, if you own land, a substantial farm or ranch asset, that you do not own that alone, right? It is not tied to your nuclear family. I guarantee some of the parcels are owned by relatives, maybe by your parents, maybe by siblings, maybe by your cousins. And now the question of how to leverage stacked enterprises probably is relative to more than just you. And I just want to like pause there because I think it's easy to get into the optimization game, and I love mathematical optimization. But if you say, and I've watched this play out on farms and ranches that I've been a part of and that have been close to me in my life, is if you say, hey, we're going to start a hunting business on this property, but your uncle has brought his friends to hunt here every year forever and has half ownership in the property or something, then you forgot to take full inventory of the situation. You forgot about the human element. And so when thinking about stacking enterprises, I just want to say that it's very, or if you're like, there's a solar opportunity, and it's really easy as the young generation to be like, mom, dad, grandpa, whoever is involved in the thing, like we have this new opportunity, and that's incredible. Like there are a lot of good opportunities to bring back to the farm or the ranch, but to add value to that land asset. But knowing first that navigating the social and family dynamics of that asset, whoever owns it, or even if it's a leased situation, having to navigate the lease terms is going to be the hardest part, any of that, most likely. Yeah. I just think people forget about that. I don't know if I maybe I answered enough of your question. Feel free to follow up on that if I didn't.
I love the optimization versus human reality comment, but I'm going to ask you to sit just for a minute in the optimization framework.
Plan.
And, there is a lot of conversation about stacked enterprises, whether it's, livestock integration into row crops, whether it's solar, agrivoltaics, whether it's carbon and insetting could be considered stacked enterprises. So I'm just curious to get your take on the role that you see those playing right now and how effective or not the adoption is.
Everybody managing a business needs to think about stacked enterprises, whatever the business is, right? If you have an asset, you should be thinking about leveraging that asset to as many different ways as possible if profitability is your goal, right? And so stacked enterprises allow you to reduce risk by like spreading that risk across different enterprises. And especially in farming and ranching, to the point of the things you just talked about are crucial, right? Where like years like this, you're running a corn and soy operation. It's not a fun year to be you. But if you're running a beef operation, you are taking me out to dinner later, because it is, the beef market has been so great this last year. So that it's just a perfect example. And so if I'm running both of those enterprises together, I've now remembered that I'm in commodity markets writ large. Even if I've created my own niche market, I'm still going to be influenced by commodity pricing. And so having multiple enterprises is undoubtedly a benefit to any operation. Now, something to consider though, is it can reduce the time you put into the one thing you might be really good at. And so like, again, the economist in me is like, it depends. But if you spread yourself too thin and you're across 9 different enterprises and you're managing a hospitality business and you're managing a beef business and you're running a row crop and farming business and you're doing all of that together, if you've spread yourself too thin and your resources that you're managing are just you and your kiddos or you and your brother or whatever it is, and you guys have spread yourself too thin and you do all of it poorly, then it wasn't worth stacking the enterprises, right? And that's why it's just really depends on the individual business and the assets that they have to leverage. But I think it is an important tool that we have in the toolbox of managing any business, and especially farm and ranch businesses, where we can kind of compound value across the supply chain by stacking enterprises. A really good example from my ranching background is a mathematical optimization that I really wanted to do. And I actually built this as part of my graduate work, was based on forage availability. The the variability in forage. Bear with me, this is going to get a little deep. So you can look at like the worst year that you have on your ranch, right? If you build your cow herd to the worst year, so you look at the last 20 years of forage availability and you say like, okay, what could I support on my ranch on those really bad drought years, those 2002, 2012 years? Then I build my cow herd numbers to that. Then everything on top of that, I build a yearling enterprise on top of my cow calf enterprise, because my yearlings are a variable enterprise, and grass we know is a variable thing year by year. And so I can match my variable enterprise to my variable resource. And I've buffered against being a price taker on buying calves every year by having my own cow calf supply. Like, and that's like a pretty standard, like if you're kind of a more regenerative or even just maybe progressive rancher, you're thinking about mapping your cow herd to a lower supply and then running some sort of variable enterprise on for big grass years versus small, because there's emotional toil in getting rid of cows. And so it's really, really hard to sell cows on time when there's a drought, because you've put a lot into your genetics and you don't want to just sell a bunch of coal cows because it's a drought year. Like, it's really hard. And so typically a lot of ranchers do that too late because it's such a hard decision to make, and they've over extracted their resource and maybe damaged future years' potential because of that. So anyway, that's kind of a niche example, but
Thank you for sharing that example. It's a good one, and I think illustrates the way that things are done and could be done around these decisions and optimizing them. I'd love to turn now to a topic that has been really important this year. And actually, I'm glad we're talking about it now with you and not maybe earlier on in March, because I think there's a lot more to reflect on. And that topic is public financing and the role that that lever plays in supporting soil health. So, speaking from your experience with the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities program, which is now known as the Advancing Markets Program, AMP, what do you think we're going to see from this in terms of impacts on the future of soil health incentives or the infrastructure available for that?
well, I'll be the first to say that there were problems in the initial design, right? There was things that I was just like, oh, that's unfortunate, where every recipient of the project was having to spin up their own data management system right? I mean, you worked on some of this stuff, Sammy, like that was silly because the structure was so unique to the program, making everybody spin up their own software team or whatever to this programmatic level, rather than rolling it out from the top of just saying, here's a platform that all of you can use that's nice, that we spent some actual time with and actually built well to be able to be used, and everybody can use the same one. You can custom brand it. If they would have just thought about the product first there, so that you could reduce the cost, where every one of these teams who are not software teams didn't have to rebuild the same thing. That was a huge amount of waste. And huge administrative burden, not just to the technology teams, but to the operational teams who were just trying to figure out, I have no idea how I'm supposed to deliver practice standards across acres, pay on those amounts. Like, every team was challenged to solve the same problem, which is just inherently kind of a poor project design, because you want them spending all of that mental energy solving the real problem that you were trying to solve, which they weren't doing for the first year and a half. They were just trying to figure out how to solve the bureaucracy of data collection and management for these like NRCS practice code standards and delivering that to farms. What we wanted out of that project, and what some folks really made some awesome strides in, is about building markets, right? Building new markets for commodity goods that are grown differently. And market development is really, really hard and expensive. And every time that we think, oh, the private sector does it better, I'll challenge people to like look at history of like who's actually developed those markets. Is almost always the like federal governments or state government. Like, there is a role to be played by governments to help facilitate the creation of markets, because the amount of capital and the amount of risk that it takes to try to create a new market. A good example is folks tried to do the alternative meat thing, and that was a huge investment, and that was a private investment, right? And they tried to create a new market, and it's still going on. But I would say probably the ROI on that, from what I have heard in that sector, has not been there, right? Where it was a huge risk and a lot of private investors lost a lot of money. And it's kind of a values question of whether we think the role of the government should be to de-risk some of these new market developments. But I think the power of a program like Climate Smart Commodities was they were saying, okay, across the country, across different markets, let's put some investment into developing new markets for producers and see what sticks in the market long term. That early stage stuff is really, really crucial. And it's so risky for producers to coalesce and build new markets, or even for investors to want to do that. And so the role of the government to step in and do that, I think was powerful and could continue to be powerful but I think that unfortunately the new AMP model is really, really about just paying producers for practices. So it's kind of like not much of the money is going towards market development. A lot of it, they're like, it needs to go to farmers and ranchers. And it's like that there's a role for programs to do that, to pay for conservation practices, but those exist already through the CSP program, the CRP program, the EQIP program, all these other farm bill programs. And we really my hope was that could be a pool of funding that would spend its time more on the market side and less on the just pay farmers to do a practice.
But it's called advancing markets, Reid.
Yes. Language is important.
Isn't it?
Can you ground us in your direct experience here? What projects were you involved with, and how have they evolved currently, to the extent that you're comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, we worked with I think 3 or 4 different projects. None of those have rolled forward. As we sit today on November 6th, the government is shut down. A lot of those were moving forward through the process of renewal through the AMP project, but haven't gotten approved at this point because the government shut down. So I'm not putting any of my company's eggs in the government funding basket, but if it comes through, we'd love to work on it and continue to do so. We worked mostly with folks in the animal side of things, just because with animals, you have to track more than acres, right? You got to track animals as well. And so we just kind of are pretty good at that data model. And so various folks working on beef, bison, sheep, and particularly in the Northern Great Plains.
Are there any tools in the tools graveyard that you were talking about that you'd like to sort of rescue or resuscitate?
Oh my gosh. One of the things that Hornada they might still keep a list of tools available to ranchers. And it was a meta moment where you click into all these broken links, right? And there's just, because of the funding cycles of tools, I think we haven't visited it with it here, but I've visited with both of you about this, is the funding cycle of a lot of these tools, particularly in technology, is really tragic, because you'll fund a tool. For instance, we built the software platform for the climate for one of our clients, and it was sweet. And they spent a lot of money on what I like to think a pretty smart team to build the thing. And now it just sits in my flat storage in Google Cloud, and isn't servicing anybody. And because it was built somewhat custom for that project, and we could retool it, and we just haven't had a need to retool it. And we've taken components from it and kind of reuse those for our other clients, and a lot of learnings for sure as a team. But in the same way where I had hoped that as that project spun down and all these technical service providers had gotten hired and started to build relationships with people, I was hoping somebody like these various private funds that are interested in funding a lot of this work, I was like, they're now starting to pay attention to technical service provision, but I'm like, there's a real urgency to some of it, where the relationships, if you lay somebody off and they live in a rural community, and you had a job for them in that rural community working with working lands producers, and they get fired or the project shuts down or whatever, there's no other work in that community, right? So for that person to stay employed, they have to find a remote job or they have to leave that community. And once that person leaves that rural economy, it's much harder to get them back because there's no jobs for them there. And so that's why I thought it was really crucial for a lot of these funds where it's like, yeah, there's the software tools that are dead, but don't let the relationships die. Like step in and try to fund that person so they stay there with their family. And a lot, they might have a partner with some property or something there that will keep them there, hopefully. But we want smart, young, talented people in our rural communities across this awesome country. And I think technical service provision for working lands is a great way to do it.
So, Reid, talking about policy changes and kind of changing ag landscape as a result, I'm curious if in your ag economics hat, if you have a take on the current kind of state of the ag economy and lots of distress, commodity prices, obviously problematic, tariffs are causing problems, lots of disruption. So can you comment on that? And what's your opinion on how sort of dire this may or may not be?
Well, I'll preface this all by saying, I don't spend a lot of time in like commodity market tracking or anything. I mostly spend my time in like building software systems for our individual clients these days. So I am not like that. There are people way smarter who pay way more attention, who have the title agricultural economist like behind their name, who would know way more about kind of could speak in a more educated way to the state of agricultural markets today. However, I can speak to kind of my friends and communities that I'm a part of. And I get on the phone with a friend of mine who's a 6th generation rancher and I go, how's your year going? And they're like, it's great. And I'm like, how are you guys thinking about, the beef prices are up and they run a small cropping operation to fund their small feed yard that they run. And like, they can't really buy cows right now or calves to finish, or they can, but the unit economics on them aren't great. But they're making a lot of money on their animals. Right? And so I ask him, I go like, what are you gonna do with the money? Like how are you thinking about that? And in part because I'm curious about the way where he's getting his information on how to spend this additional capital. What's the right thing to do? And for him, he's like, well, they've been looking at buying some land, getting out of the forest. And so he's like, maybe we've been saving up money to try to make more land acquisitions and convert some of the capital you can gain from your commodity into physical land assets. So in the ranching side, it's going well. I think and that's where most of my brain will sit, is in the ranching side. I'll spend a brief moment on a question that I'm very interested in asking. So a theory in much of this, in the ranching side, things around soil health are a little different, right? Because it's about grazing management more so than like a cover crop or whatever. And there's been this theory that we've worked with many of our clients, their theory of change, right? If we increase, and the biggest threat to ranching is conversion to croplands or conversion to subdevelop the ranch into like 40s for your boomer who wants their piece of the pie. Not that it has to be a boomer, but probably is. And so that's like the greatest risk to the intact ranching land that has great value. And so there's this theory, if you increase ranch profitability, they won't convert the land, right? So because I can make money on grasslands, I'm not going to convert it to where I can make, $3,000 annual return per acre, for instance, in crop ground. So I won't till up my soil to make money. 2025 is the perfect example of where your animal resource, grazing on grass, is worth a boatload of money. Your tillage resource, converting tilled ground into cash crops, is worth nothing. Will that make a difference in terms of preserving the largest, or what's the stat here? The most threatened ecosystem in the world is the Northern Great Plains, right? And a land I spend a lot of my time in and thinking about, where, especially in that marginal prairie where grassland gets converted to cropland all the time because the returns are higher and there's farm subsidies subsidizing that, and the ethanol system, blah, blah, blah. We can go into it. This has been a year where those unit economics have not been the case. And I'm very curious to look at the data as we come out of this very unique year to see if we saw any slowing patterns on the conversion of our precious grasslands into either tilled ground or houses or converted into smaller parcels.
Yeah, it's really a tale of two cities, right? In terms of what's happening in livestock and grassland commodities, beef in particular, and what's happening in row crop commodities.
Totally.
Would you ever see that transition going the other way? Like, would it make sense this year for farmers that are tilling and growing grain or row crops to think about transitioning to a perennial pasture system? How would you think? I feel like it's easy to go the opposite way of that and harder to come back.
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. To use two examples, it's way harder to, once you've tilled up ground, it takes years and years to get it back to where it was. And in the same way, once you split it up into development, you can never reconsolidate. I mean, you can, but reconsolidating land, right, is basically impossible. So unless there's war and the land was consolidated when we won it in a war against the Native Americans as the U.S. and that war took that land and then divided it up against, American citizens we'll never get the land back basically into the state once it gets subdivided unless there's huge disruption to the system. I think you can convert it back, but you have to map economic cycles to ecological cycles, which is basically the whole failure of our system. It's really hard to do that. And I love capitalism. I love market solutions. I think the concept of a price, everybody should have to go read the seminal piece on what it takes to make a pencil, and like it's a conversation about all the things that it takes to make a pencil. And it's beautiful what we can produce as a society without anybody orchestrating it through the mechanisms of markets. But those like if I were to buy land this year that's crop ground and say I want to convert it back to prairie because it could make me a little more money, I would have bought it at a price where the high level commodity price is priced into that asset. And so I can't, and grasslands will always be cheaper than, like the asset value will always be cheaper than cropland. And so for that you need a huge swing. And then you have to think about time, right? Where everybody who's making money in the beef market this year is like, we know this isn't going to last. The beef market runs on a 10-year cycle, approximately. We're at the peak. COVID disrupted some things, but it will likely come back around, and prices will fall, and you'll see. So it's hard to make that bet as a farmer or a rancher to say, what are the markets going to do in 3 years? Especially in today's world, nobody feels secure in our markets anymore about basically anything. So.
That's so true. Yeah, it's an interesting time with lots of dynamism and change. And this is a great opportunity actually to move to another lever of these financial levers, which is commodity markets and developing markets. So there's a lot we can get into in this. I'm curious to get your take on the durability and promise of ecosystem markets in particular, whether it's carbon, water, biodiversity, whatever else. But what do you see happening today in that landscape, and what's your outlook on the future?
An analogy I like to use we'll just talk about carbon for a second, but it's kind of true for everything. So if I go and buy a barrel of oil, it sits inside of a barrel, right? It's a physical asset, and I can just measure it. It's like sits in this thing. And the cost of measurement, by the way, is very cheap because I just barrel or a scale. Very easy. If I'm buying a weight animal, we go to the sale barn and they stand on a scale. And that scale costs a little bit of money. They're not cheap. But then you reuse it for a bunch of things, and now I can buy that commodity. The effort to commoditize carbon and ecosystem benefits is a good effort. I think it's nice because what happens in resource economics is we extract a resource, and in the process of extracting that resource and converting it into value to our supply chain, there's probably some sort of externality, which is the external cost of that extraction process. Economists typically say that one of the best ways to deal with externalities is through taxation, right? You need efficient markets and efficient regulation to have efficient taxation. We don't have any of that in America, but taxation of the externality is kind of the best tool that we would, see likely as the best tool to deal with those externalities. A secondary tool is to create markets. And basically you had a bunch of economists who were like ecosystem services, and they started to be like, well, let's just use all these methodologies that we've been using or discovering to price these assets that are getting damaged or whatever. And so they've done a bunch of different ways to do that, right? How do you price these, like the water, like how do you price water quality? How do you price carbon? What does that mean? How do you price biodiversity? And a price is just what somebody is willing to pay for it, right? And so when you think about a price of these goods, there's economic loss in the whole market or inefficiencies in the market because of measurement. And then pricing these goods is really, really, really hard. And I'll spend a little bit on measurement. The analogy I use is, imagine if I have these two cups and I said, if I were to say, I'm going to sell you this cup or I'm going to sell you this cup, and there's a volume to these cups. But now imagine I just go to the faucet and I just turn it on for a little bit and then I just turn it off. And I say, that's how much water you get. And then I go to the next guy comes and I turn it on and then I turn it off. Those were probably pretty close to the same unit because I kind of felt it out each time. And maybe I put a little rhythm to it. I tapped my foot maybe. But were they actually the exact same volume? Probably not. That's kind of the situation I think we find ourselves in these ecosystem markets, right? Where we just got somebody who's kind of turning it on and turning it off and saying that's a unit of carbon. And then another guy comes in and says, turns it on and turns it off and goes, no, that's a unit of carbon. And then you try to trade those two units to each other and you go, well, maybe mine is more than yours, but I don't know. It all went down the drain. We never saw it. Right. And so that's the hard part about these markets is measurement is kind of subjective. No matter how good you are at modeling, it will always be beyond the tangible. Right. And that's kind of the beauty of ecosystem services is they exist beyond the tangible, right? It's you walk in a forest and it feels good. And how do you price the fact that it feels good to be in a forest? And like, that's where our resource economic systems start to fall apart pretty quickly is how do you value these intangible goods? And then how do you value the cost of getting rid of them? And like water quality. And so like having quality water is this awesome thing when you can go to that faucet and you can drink from it. How do you cost that? And a lot of economists work really, really hard and they're really smart people to try to do that. So anyway, all this to say, I think carbon markets, ecosystem service markets are valuable tools. Would I prefer taxation on the companies extracting the resource? Yes, I think it's a more powerful tool. We are not going to get that. So using markets is great. But I think what I've liked to see, and I think we've seen it, is back to my point of the price is what you're willing to pay for something. And we're seeing that it's less of a commodity market and it's more of the price somebody's willing to pay for the story you're telling. And man, that is the most American thing I've ever heard, right? Is where it's about how good of a storyteller you are of the benefit that your project is doing. And you tell that story through data. You tell that story through experience, bringing your funders at Microsoft out to farms and ranches that are healthy and vibrant. And you say, look, you can pay me per ton, or you can pay me for the benefit of this intangible thing. And, both have their place, but I think it's really nice when we've moved away from trying to just compare these guys turning on the faucets and turning them off and more just say, isn't it cool that we have water? And hey, corporations, you're not going to get taxed for this, but what if we just started to value this as a society? The last thing I'll note here is oil companies have been pricing the cost of carbon emissions for like 20 years in all of their accounting systems. They've, as if they were going to get taxed, right? Most oil companies have been pricing the cost of carbon emissions into all of their economic modeling for many, many years. So
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. I'd love to have some resources there we can share with folks.
yeah, it's been a long time since. I know that's true, but I could probably find some. It's an easy Google.
I do want to ask you about one more financial lever where I think you have unique insight and experience, and that's philanthropic capital. You've worked inside and alongside and on behalf of some of the leading nonprofits in the soil health space. And so I'm curious if you have a read on effective programs, what you would say to program designers, what you would say to producers who are participating in those programs, just what's your overall hot take?
My hot take on philanthropic capital. My real hot take is that I think culture matters a lot, and in everything that we do. When we think about inefficiencies in government agencies or whatever, it's like first thing you should start is how do you create a culture of delivery, right? Don't start with cutting people. Do what a business leader would do and be like, let's create a culture where we're more efficient and we give our employees the tools to do that. Culture matters. And I think the culture of philanthropic capital is very risk averse, and which is really, really unfortunate, right? Because in my opinion, the philanthropic capital, not the like ROI capital, not the like, hey, we can take a lower return for this thing, but I'm talking like real, somebody donates $5 million to something and doesn't need that $5 million back. That money is so important to any sector because it is free capital that doesn't have to get paid back, that should be leveraged at the highest possible risk. When that philanthropic money gets leveraged to like a policy team to like write another white paper, my hot take is that drives me crazy because
Thank you.
that money is so important, and there's funds out there to fund people writing white papers. But if you could use that in a business context to go and fund something that's weird, like just go and try putting 8 advisors into a state representing agents or representing farms and ranches and getting them enrolled and give money for them to their startup costs, right? For them to file their LLC, give them, hey, you can take 10 grand from this pool of money to start your little business. Like those are the things where it's just like, give it up and give it a try. If there is true philanthropic capital out there, I would say like but the culture around it is like, well, if we get a white paper deliverable or we get this PDF, we can file it on a shelf and we felt good about it. Where it's like, no, like it might not work at all, but that high leverage capital, in my opinion, should be used for high risk, but high return opportunities that no sort of like financial instrument or even federal instrument has the capacity to fund.
This is where you mentioned culture matters, like the culture of philanthropy versus the culture of entrepreneurship.
Well, and we always say like, and there's some folks at Climate Week that I think did a good job speaking to this too, and I'm happy to hear it, is like the pilot project doom loop is what we call it. And it's like, it's just, they want to fund a pilot. And it's these like little research trials things. And then nobody knows how to move from pilot to anything else, right? Because pilots are safe, but funding like a research pilot is very different than funding like a product that can, like a product can stand on its own. A pilot never can, right? And so how do you fund early products rather than another pilot? And like, that's just a culture shift. And the VC space did a really good job of this. But the problem is that the structure of venture capital doesn't map to the agricultural sector, because move fast, break things doesn't work when you get one shot a year. If you're working with the sun and ecological systems to turn soil, water, and sun into value, you get one shot a year typically. And moving fast and breaking things means you lost that entire year's worth of crop, that entire whatever. And so venture, I think we saw the ag tech thing felt like maybe it was the wrong funding mechanism for a lot of ideas. But the concept around like, dude, bet big and maybe it's outsized returns. I think what's unfortunate about the ag thing is you might have to bet big. And this is what farmers and ranchers are doing all the time, is you might bet big for pretty medium returns. But it's like, do we care about the things? And that's why like ranchers and farmers do what they do, is they're betting big because they love the resources that they get to manage. And it'd be cool if capital started to think similarly along those lines.
Reid, I so appreciate talking to you. It's super inspiring. I think framing soil health through this lens of wise resource management is, because it extends much further than that, outside of just quote unquote the biogeochemical, kind of assets that you're trying to activate through soil health.
Manage our entire communities. It's human resources, right? It's like you have employees. How do you make sure your employees are happy and that and like there's so many more resources, but soil is such a key resource that it is the most fun thing we could work on. Getting to better our soil health, like that's so sick. Why would you want to work on anything else?
I agree. That's amazing. Reid, as we are running out of time on this great conversation, I'd love to give you an opportunity to share one more insight or hope or question with our audience. So what do you want to leave us all with today?
Okay, well, I already said the first thing, that working on soil is so fun. So what a cool thing we all get to do. The question I'll leave people to think about is we went through, and you heard me say a lot of like, take inventory of the assets that you have and find the best way to leverage those assets. And I would challenge everybody listening to take inventory of the assets that you have. It can be your ability to play guitar. It can be the humor that you have. It can be the money that you have. It can be the land that you have, the soil that you have. What are the assets in your inventory, and how can you leverage those assets for the betterment of planet and people? And you do that, it sounds like a pretty fun way to live. So I would just challenge everybody to take inventory of what are the assets that you have to leverage towards the betterment of your community, towards people in your life, and towards our lovely little planet that we.
So inspiring, Reid. Yeah, I'm ready to run at a problem now. So thank you. It was such a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Business of Soil Health. Our goal is to explore how new financial tools may or may not support producers' stewardship of their soil. We love hearing from listeners, so don't hesitate to reach out with any suggestions or guests you'd like for us to feature. And don't forget to subscribe or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform.